Right, so I thought I would show you how to go about sharpening a fairly conventional bushcraft knife. This is still a bit shop soiled. I was lighting the barbecue with it the other evening, so it's all covered in my sort of marks from the ferro rod. The groin that's on this knife is okay, slightly different to what you would get on a fairly conventional sort of pocket knife. So normally what you'll find is you either have a primary groin that's either flat, or this one is actually hollow ground, and then normally what you get is this small secondary bevel on there. Now that is relatively quick and easy to sharpen because you're only removing a small amount of steel, but the difficulty people have is that it's holding that angle. When you actually place that on the stone, because it's such a narrow bevel of steel, such a small section of actual contact with the stone, that they find that it's really difficult to maintain that consistent angle. The big advantage of using that Scandi groin that we have on all our sort of woodcraft knives and bushcraft knives is that it's almost got its own built-in sort of honing angle. The fact that this is completely, totally flat, that when I lay that on the stone I get this fantastic response, and I can almost feel it like click into place, and that gives me the guide, so then when I sharpen I know that I'm not going to be rocking it. I'll show you a few top tips on how to make sure that you don't rock it or roll it or round the edges and things like that. And you can use that same technique for conventional grinds, like on your chef's knives and on your pocket knives. But obviously the thing that you will find still difficult is that you've got to remember to lock that wrist so that you're not rocking and rolling on the actual bevel. So it's a bit more technique, but the whole idea of how we're going to do it is pretty much the same whether it's a Scandi grind or a secondary bevel. I'll put this down, I think, so I'll try and maintain their white tablecloth. So what I tend to use for sharpening is water stones. I find that these I can get very good results. I get consistent results. The technique, it doesn't matter whether you're using a very high-tech diamond stone, it doesn't matter if you're using an oil stone. The idea and the technique that we're using is going to be the same whatever medium you use. I also use a lot of sandpaper in the workshop for sharpening. You get the same results, but obviously sandpaper is a little bit cheaper. You can get various grades of it, but you do need to back it up onto a hard material like glass or a piece of wood. You can't just use it unsupported, otherwise it will just your knife will cut straight through it. The price difference. These diamond stones, these fancy DMT ones, yes, they might last for probably 20-30 years and stay completely dead flat, but that's about 120 quid's worth, so don't lose that. These double-sided Japanese water stones, that goes for about 38 quid, something like that. And I've, not this particular one because I've worn my other one out, but this particular style of stone I've been using for over 10 years, and I find that it's really versatile. I've got one side that's 1000 grit, which is a really good medium grade stone that's quite good for removing a relative amount of damage from your edge. And then we've got a 6000 grit on the other side, which is really fine. It's almost like a piece of marble, and that will give you a highly polished finish. The reason why I like this stone is it's big enough for sharpening my bushcraft knife. It's big enough for me to sharpen chisels and plane irons and things like that. But it's also small enough that if I want to sharpen my parang or my axe or anything, I can quite comfortably hold it in my hand, and it gives me a light enough stone that I can use it actually like that as well. So for value for money and versatility, I'd say that the Japanese water stones are probably the way to go. I should have put this into soak a little bit earlier. It's a little bit dry. You don't want to store these in water, especially if you're in an outdoor workshop and it's winter time, because if the frost gets in it, you'll find that it will break the stone down and it will go really crumbly. I didn't listen to my own advice, and I left this in water, and it started to go a little bit crumbly, especially the finer grits. So try and make sure that you don't store it in water. But you do need to hydrate it before you use it. So basically you need to soak it for at least 30 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, something like that, or until you stop the seeing the water actually just disappearing. If you try and use it when it hasn't been soaking long enough, as soon as you lift it out of the water, you'll see the water disperse into the stone. And if the surface gets dry, it's going to be less efficient. You actually want a combination of the actual stone breaking down and the water to act as a lubricant to help remove steel particles and to help your knife and tool slide across the surface of the stone. So we'll stick that down, A little squeezy bottle is quite good as well, if you've got a little squirty bottle or a squeezy bottle to keep the stone hydrated as you work. Now the main factor when it comes to sharpening is good lighting conditions, which under this moonlit backdrop is not brilliant. So if I'm in the workshop, I try and set up my sharpening bench either near a window, or I buy loads of angle poised lamps from IKEA. And the bulbs that I've started to get recently are daylight bulbs. It sounds pedantic, but if you get some, they're low wattage, but if you get like a 22 watt daylight bulb, it's amazing how much you can see. Like, I'm getting older and the glasses are getting thicker, but if you've got good light, it makes a hell of a difference. And being able to see that cutting edge is the key to sharpening. So what I'd do is I'd assess the edge, I'd look down it, and I'd get my angle poised lamp to look down it as well. And I'd tilt it and try and look to see if there was any light bouncing back at me. Now obviously if you've hit a nail or something when you're out in the woods, then you're going to find a big divot or a big flat spot, and that will be bouncing a lot of light back at you. So any light that you see is normally a flat spot or a bit of damage, so that's something to bear in mind. This isn't too bad because it got sharpened at the Bushcraft show, which was the last time it got sharpened, which was only a few weeks ago. So it's not desperately dull, but I'll show you as if it was. So depending on how damaged the tool is, depends on how coarse a grade of sharpening stone I start with. If it's really heavily damaged, then you might need to resort to a grinder. If it's not too bad, you can maybe use a coarse stone, but for most normal use you'll probably find that the 1000 grit of the Japanese waterstone will be fine. The other thing that I like to do is I like to see where I'm actually removing steel, and the thing that I find the most useful is if you get a marker pen, not that this is a brilliant pen, and colour in that bevel. And what we want to try and do is colour that bevel in so that when we place it on the stone and we start to remove steel, don't buy Wilko's marker pens, they're not very good, you need a good old Sharpie. But colour that in and it will normally be nice and black. And then when we place that onto the stone, as soon as we start making contact with that stone, we will start to remove the pen and we can start to see where we're removing the steel. Now if we were to remove only the pen from the very front edge of the bevel, that tells us that we are actually lifting too high. So the back edge is coming up too high and we're starting to put a secondary bevel on there. The other alternative is that we start to remove just the pen from the back of the bevel. That means we're laying too flat. So ideally what we're trying to do is we're trying to take that pen off and make contact with the bevel the whole way along in one go. The temptation is, because it's quicker, is that you just think, oh, I'll just cheat a little bit and I'll just lift it by just a few degrees and put a slight secondary on there. It will get it sharp quicker, but the next time you come to sharpen, you'll have to tilt a little bit more, and the next time a little bit more, and before you know it, you've got something that should have like a 25-degree cutting edge on it, and suddenly it'll be like 30, and then it'll be 40, and it'll be more and more obtuse. And the more obtuse the tool is, the less it likes to cut effectively. You're trying to push the material through the wood. So what we want to do is keep the surface of that stone nice and wet, and then we lay it flat onto the stone. Normally I start by doing this straight section of the knife, so I lay it square to the stone and I lift it up, and I don't know whether you guys can see on the big screen. Can you see how that water sort of squirts out from underneath the bevel? And the dirtier the water gets, the easier it is to see. And that's also a really good indicator that I'm absolutely dead flat on that bevel. As soon as I see that water squirt out, I start to go forward and back. Also keeping the surface of the stone wet, you're almost cutting the surface of the stone off. So it's another visual indicator that you're actually getting the right angle. Now that will remove, you won't be able to quite see the pen because it wasn't a brilliant pen, but that's starting to remove the material all the way from front to back, but only on that front section or that flat section of the bevel. It isn't making contact where it starts to turn around the bend, so it's not making contact where the belly of the knife is through to the tip. So in order to get that, I take a slightly different grasp. I normally put my forefinger down onto the blade so that I can feel a little bit more, and I go 45 degrees or roughly to the stone. And what we're going to do is we're going to still lay it on, make sure that we get that water squirting out. And what we're going to do is we're going to make back and forth movements, and gradually lift this backhand. And as I lift this backhand, it will rock that bevel all the way through, right through till we get to the tip. Now, if you try and do it all in one go, that's where you get mistakes. So you just want to do one little section at a time. And as we work, I don't know if you can see on the screen, you're starting to sort of cut that slurry off in different sections of the bevel. So now I'm getting close to the tip now, and now I'm right through to the tip. Now the fear is that if I keep lifting this backhand, you can get it so that there's a great big groove in your stone. It's not very good for your stone, and it also doesn't do much for the tip of your knife. So often, to do that last little bit, I would do it just by drawing backwards. That way there's no fear of diving into the surface of your stone. And what you should have is that we've removed all the pen, all the way along, round from the belly, right through to the tip of the knife. If you've still got any pen left, continue the process. And it doesn't matter, you're not counting strokes at this stage, you're just using the pen as a witness mark and also making sure that you've got right through to the tip. So now what we do is repeat exactly the same process, but on the opposite side of the bevel. Now, some people will change hands. I'm right-handed, so I find that I lose all kind of control with that. So I prefer to still hold it in my right hand, but rather than pushing away from me, this instance, I'm actually going to be drawing it back towards myself. So we'll start with that flat section again. I actually find that this side is actually easier for me. I think it's because I can see more clearly what I'm doing, and I feel like I can apply more pressure. Now, when you're learning, especially on this side, you might find that it's more sort of convenient and more efficient and better for the tool when you're learning to actually only concentrate on the push stroke and just reapply the tool at the end of each stroke. Because I've been doing it for a bit now, I'm quite happy that I can do back and forth motions. When you're learning, if you do that back and forth, sometimes there's a tendency to round the bevel ever so slightly, so concentrate just on those push strokes to start with. So we'll turn it over, we'll do the other side. Same with this, if you find that you're more confident just pulling towards you, then you can just do that. Now the surface of this stone is not quite flat. It's sort of worn slightly, because the Japanese water stone is a lot softer than an oil stone. It really needs flattening really, so if I wanted to get a really pucker job of this, I'd actually flatten the surface of this stone first. And you can either use a diamond stone for doing that, or a bit of wet and dry sandpaper on a piece of glass, or an old paving slab or something like that, and that will flatten the surface, and it will bring lots of nice new fresh grit up as well. Some people think that a water stone being soft is a disadvantage compared to an oil stone, but my way of thinking is that if it does dish, it's much easier to actually re-flatten it. An oil stone, you have to tend to take it to somebody like a stonemason or somebody doing headstones and get them to flatten it. So to do the belly through to the tip, we take that same 45-degree angle again. I'll try and move, normally I'll put my finger here, but you won't be able to see what we're doing, so I'll move it out of the way, and you can start to see, as I lift this backhand, you can start to see how it sort of almost cuts that slurry off the surface of the stone. So I'll do one little bit at a time again. And I'm pretty happy that we got through, right through to that tip. Now, the other thing, it sounds crazy, but when it comes to wiping the slurry off the knife, don't be just tempted to just drag it through, because even though it might not be razor sharp, it will still be ragged and sharp enough to cut through this rag and straight into your fingers. So make sure that you are careful when you wipe off that slurry, so that you don't cut your fingers. So I'm looking down the edge, and if anything, I think I need to do a little bit more, because there's still a little bit of a light spot there, because it's not truly flat, this stone. So we'll just do a little bit more on that side. Now some people say to me, because they've obviously seen lots of YouTube videos and read lots of books, that you're supposed to do 20 passes on this side, 20 passes on that side, and then 5, and then 4, and all this. And sometimes they're so obsessed with counting that they forget what they're actually doing, which is trying to effectively abrade that steel, get each side meeting at the smallest point possible, and to get rid of any damage. So I don't count. Maybe it's because I'm Herefordian and I'm not very good at counting at the best of times. But all I concentrate on is getting rid of any of those flat spots and making sure that I keep those bevels nice and flat. So if I see any pen, I just continue the process. And at any point during this process, if you can't see what you're doing, clean it down and repen it. It doesn't matter how long it takes, but you don't want to be tempted to round that bevel over. So I'll just finish off this belly and tip area on both sides. And then what we'll do is we'll turn the stone over. So I'm pretty happy that I've got rid of all those flat spots. You can almost at this stage feel that there's a slight burr on this side. Now a burr is effectively where you get one cutting edge meeting the other point to the point that the edge is so thin that it actually sort of deforms and it actually hooks over. And it will feel like a slight ragged hook. As you drag your finger off it, you'll feel it catching your skin. Now, you don't have to get a heavy burr every time. There is this school of thought that every time you sharpen, you should create a burr to the point that you polish it off and you create what we call a wire edge. Now, a wire edge is effectively a piece of steel or a piece of burr that you can actually peel off like a little strand of silver wire. That's extreme. You don't have to go to that point every time, but at least you know it's a good visual indicator that you've actually reached ultimate sharpness. So we'll flip that stone over. What I would say is a real big advantage is to get one of these little rubber blocks for the water stone. For one, it stops it sliding around, but the other thing it does is it lifts the stone ever so slightly further off the workbench. So when you're holding your knife, you're not clattering your knuckles on the workbench as well. So that's a bit of a luxury, but it does make a difference. So we'll repeat the process. So we'll start again on that flat section, laying it on the stone. You can really see how it starts to slice that surface of the water off. And you can probably hear it. It's much, much finer, much smoother than that other side. So all this is doing is polishing. It's basically scratch refinement. You're not trying to remove any amount of steel. What you're trying to do is polish out those scratches from the previous grip. And the way I like to think of sharpening is it's just like sanding a piece of timber. If you start off with a coarse grit and finish on a coarse grit, you're going to see very noticeable scratches. Whereas if you go finer and finer and finer grades, the scratches are going to almost disappear. And sharpening is basically that. You're just polishing two edges. That's all you're doing. So we'll flip it over and we'll do the other side. And then that belly through to the tip again. And then we'll turn that slowly down. Now some people will use that slurry to clean their bevels and their sides and their flats of their knives by sort of rubbing it on and using it like a polishing paste. I try and avoid getting my finger anywhere near there because if I slip I'm just going to cut my fingers. So if you do want to clean the flats, you can actually clean the flats on the sharpening stone, or you can use a little abrasive cleaner to clean those up. But as long as the cutting edge is shiny, that's the main thing. So that's not looking too bad. Now, as I was finishing off that sharpening, I was easing off the pressure on both sides, because effectively, even though we're not counting, we want to try and fatigue that burr to the point that it's almost going to want to pop off. The difficulty is, when you're learning, is if you're using a hard stone, you'll probably find that whichever side you come off last, the burr is always hooked onto the alternative side, the opposite side. So the easiest way to get rid of that burr is to strop it. Now you can use your leather belt wrapped around a branch. I find that you will get sort of inconsistent results with using a soft strop, because depending on how hard you pull and how hard you push with your knife varies the amount of deflection of that leather. So you could have anything from a very flat belt to a very curved belt. And if it curves too much around that cutting edge, you're actually going to blunt it more than you're going to sharpen it. So I find that if you use a fixed strop, or what we call a paddle strop, So these are a piece of board. They want to be fairly thick, so this is about 20 mil thick, and then we stick a piece of leather on there with the fluffy side uppermost. Now the fluffy side we can charge with this stuff. Now this is the magic stuff. This is Torment paste. It is very, very, very fine grit in a carrier paste, which we can squirt onto the surface of that leather. And the leather effectively is the carrier that holds that cream in place while we strop the tool. And because it's supported, the leather's supported by that piece of wood, that leather can only deform the same amount each time. So no matter how hard I push, it will only deform round the cutting edge and the same amount each time. So with stropping, it's really important that we don't ever push into the cutting edge. We're only drawing away. In the first few passes, you'll probably start to see how that lovely white paste suddenly goes grey. Now that grey is actually the particles of steel being polished away. So all it's doing is refining that scratch pattern again. So away from the cutting edge. It's not so critical to get the angle absolutely spot on. You don't want to be putting a secondary bevel on it, but as long as you get it flat on that main bevel, you haven't got to be absolutely critical. And then we alternate it to the other side. So we come away from this cutting edge. I normally support it on the bench like so. And I'm pushing reasonably hard to start with, and then I ease off the pressure and I actually alternate the strokes slightly, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to fatigue that burr, bending it back and forth until the point that it actually just pops off. Just like so. So we'll clean off that slurry. You don't need to apply that paste every time. It was only because that was a new strop that I had to put some on, but you'll probably get 6 or 7 sharpens before you need to put a little bit more cream on. I don't know whether you can catch that on camera now, look. That's the kind of level of shine we're looking for. So that paste puts just a real nice glimmer right on that cutting edge. I'll look down it, make sure there's no light spots bouncing back at me. And then the final thing I like to do is I come off the edge with my thumb. So I'm feeling to see if there's any burr on there. I normally do the opposite side just with the forefinger. And then to test to see if it's sharp, I come off the edge and ever so gently just push back. And what I want to feel is that it's just biting into that sort of dead layer of flesh on my thumb, and I can feel that it's sharp. You definitely don't want to be running your thumb down it, otherwise we'll be going over to see a St John's ambulance here. But that feels pretty good. Now the other way that I like to test it is I get my thumbnail and I hold the knife at a very acute angle on my thumbnail. If it skids off, it's dull. If it bites into my nail like so, it's really nice and sharp, so that feels pretty good. And the other thing that I like to do is just to test the cutting edge. So it doesn't have to be newspaper, but what we're looking for is we want to test this edge. Now you've probably all seen the YouTube videos where they swing the knife and it chops through it. That really doesn't do anything, it just shows that they've got a bit of an ego thing going on. But what we want to do is we want to feel down that cutting edge. Now, we couldn't run our thumb down it because we'll end up bleeding. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the paper to feel all the way down that cutting edge. So I start right near the handle and I want to try and drag it very, very slowly through the paper. And if it stops or stalls at any point along that edge, that's normally where there's a little bit of a burr or a defect or a dent or a bit of damage, and you need to go back to the stone. So just run it through so that you can feel all the way along that cutting edge, and there wants to be as little resistance as possible. So that's pretty good. And if you can get really nice thin shavings, then it means that it's nice and sharp. So that feels pretty good actually. Now the other thing that I like to do, just as a final little sort of extra level of sharpness, is I get me a bit of newspaper and I'll wrap it around my strop, and I like to use paper with as much black ink as possible really, because the black ink is just a very, very fine grit really. It's just finer than that Torment paste that we've been using earlier on. Now, I don't know whether any of you guys remember watching your nan clean the windows, and when she'd finish washing them with water, she'd always buff them afterwards with a piece of newspaper, and effectively that's what you're doing. You're putting ultimate shine on your knife, and you can see that it's really starting to glimmer now. When I was down in London one time, we went to this Japanese knife shop, and this guy was showing us how to sharpen, and he used newspaper, and he reckoned it was because the blades were carbon steel, and that's carbon print, and by running it in the same direction you realign the molecules so they're all facing the same way. It sounded a lot more magical than the fact that that's finer than that, but you can use whatever magic you want really. So that's nice and sharp, but everybody likes to see how sharp, so can you catch my ginger hair on camera? It's a bit too fine, but basically everything we want is shaving sharp. Okay, so I'm getting bolder. We call that in the trade woodsman's alopecia, because by the time you finish sharpening all your tools and all your axes, you end up with a big bold patch on your arm. So it seems extreme to sharpen a knife to that level, but if you can get your knife as sharp as that, when you come to actually use it for craft work, it means that you're having to apply a lot less pressure when you're using the knife, so therefore you're in a lot more control. So if it does slide through, you're not putting so much force that it does a lot of damage. So it's extreme, but that's how sharp I like my tools to be. The other thing that I would suggest is that when you're carving or doing any craft work, always have your strop to hand, because if you're in the middle of a spoon and you feel that that edge has just lost its bite, you could almost bring it back by 2 or 3 of those. It'll be sharp again, and you don't have to stop and get all covered in slurry. If you leave it for, I don't know, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years before you go back to sharpening your knife, it will be so blunt that it'll have such a flat spot that you'll probably have to use a mechanical grinder to get an edge back rather than just using a stone. So when it comes to sharpening, little and often is the key. The more often that you do it, the less work you have to put in. So a strop every 5 minutes is the way to go. Just like a barber, you know, he'd stop and strop his razor every few minutes really. So that's that. Obviously that's carbon steel. So because I've been using moisture on my Waterstone, the way I like to protect that, to make sure that I don't leave any moisture on that blade so that it's rusty next time I come to use it, we use these handy little camellia oil applicators. And camellia's nice food safe oil, so if I go and cut my cheese sarnie with this afterwards, I know that I'm not going to be ingesting any horrible petrochemical stuff. So a little wipe with that camellia oil, and then we can resheathe that, and I know it's nice and sharp next time I come to use it. Okay, so very simple techniques, there's nothing elaborate about it. I think people like to make sharpening a lot more sort of mythical than it needs to be. Sharpening is just about polishing 2 surfaces to the point that they meet at the smallest point possible. Okay, so hopefully that's giving you the confidence to just try it, and yeah, give it a go really. Good light and a bit of time, and that's it really. Any questions on that? No, you're all confident to do it now, eh? Fantastic. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I know it was brief, but there you go.
Yeah, brilliant.
Oh, here you go. A cheesy pun now. If you want strops or honing paste or Waterstones, I think there's a guy in there selling them.
Yeah, Mr. Orford.
Yeah, I think he's ginger. Okay, cheers, guys.
Yeah, that's it.